Okay, first thing I'm going to tell you is that this is being recorded. We have a couple of members who requested that I be able to share it with them, and so that is what I'm doing. So I'm telling you this in case you object to having your face or voice recorded. This purpose that it would be recorded for is only to share with other interested history buffs. There's no commercial intent with it or sharing generally. But just to advise you, you are voice and picture being recorded. So we're talking about the presidents. We're going to have a little historical contextual review of presidential administrations. We are about to embark on the 46th, and it's 46th, though there have only been 45 people, men, who have ever occupied the spot because we count Cleveland twice. Now let me underscore, these are not my rankings. I'm not sophisticated enough as a historian to make rankings, although as an amateur, I certainly have my opinions about various rankings. The slides you're going to see that have the picture and the information about what was happening during their administration are compiled by CBS News and are pretty much up to date, but it is their ranking of who's first, second, third, fourth, etc. Then a little bit later, then also we're going to have, following that, the second slide for each president will be the 2017 C-SPAN Presidential Historian Survey. And so that one is a little, I don't know, just their version of what they think about presidents. And of course, 2017 is a while ago, so these things change. Then we'll take a look at the Siena College Research Institute from 2018. Periodically, Siena College does a survey of historians. They do, last time they did 153 prominent presidential historians, and this will be how they ranked the presidents. Finally, towards the end, I will get to a book by Elvin Felsenberg, published in 2008. There's another ranking, and it's an interesting book to read. I would caution you to remember that pretty much historians will tell you you cannot have an accurate ranking of history or presidents until 20 years after their term of office expires. That's because you need to have everybody die. Once people have died, then you can begin to go back and have a more objective look. And even a more credible standard is 50 years. And then I will also underscore that each year these rankings change. So number 7 might be number 8 next year and vice versa. So anyway, so bear with me as we go through this. Number 10, we're talking the best presidents ranking first. Number 10, Lyndon Baines Johnson, 63 to 69. This is the Cold War period, the time of the Great Society, his famous War on Poverty. And you notice a long list there of social and cultural developments. It was a time of real civil rights action and strife. In the beginning, most of it pretty good. He did a lot of things in the early years of his administration. But one of the things that generally is regarded as bad, you'll see down at the bottom, he embarked on expanding the war in Vietnam. And that had very negative consequences for his presidency and his reputation. And in fact, it was such a negative thing that by 1968, he declined to run for another term. So he tops the chart for his efforts in pursuing equal justice. So let's take a look at some of the things. These are the C-SPAN factors that they took a look at. Pretty low in moral authority, and particularly low in his international relations. On the other hand, he did halfway well in administrative skills and relations with Congress, vision setting, and pursuing equal justice for all. Equal Rights Amendment and so forth came during his tenure. And he ranks number 10, and he is therefore in the blue category or in the first quartile. Number 9, Ronald Reagan. This again is the Cold War period. He has the Iran-Contra affair. He finally has to admit that he did wrong things. Time of the Rehnquist Court, and his famous Reaganomics, which is still controversial to this day. He's famous for appointing Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court. And during her time, she was arguably the most powerful woman in the world. He does get us involved militarily in Grenada. And then he famously stands before the Berlin Wall and sends a message to Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And under him, the Soviet Union really does disintegrate. And so what do we rank him? His ranking in the C-SPAN survey has risen consistently since 2000. And he's pretty highly ranked for his public persuasion, his crisis leadership, his international relations, relations with Congress, and vision setting as an agenda. He also has a good performance within the context of his time, but not so good in his administrative skills, and nor in his pursuing equal justice for all. If you are a gay person, you notice that he did very little for the problems with AIDS and so forth during this period. And so he gets an overall ranking of 9 in the first quartile. John F. Kennedy ranks number 8, Cold War period. His slogan is the new frontier. This is the baby boomers coming to their fore. We had a number of things. We had George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door in 1963, the famous March on Washington. We have books that are of great importance, The Feminine Mystique and Silent Spring. A big mistake in his Bay of Pigs invasion, but he does fantastic things, it can be said, when he counters the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And so, historians credit Kennedy most for his skills in public persuasion and his vision. He does have good moral authority, international relations, administrative skills, relations with Congress, public persuasion, crisis leadership, economic management, and his vision setting, pursued equal justice for all. And he is ranked number 8, again in the first quartile. Thomas Jefferson ranks number 7. Whoops, let me go back to that. Sorry, going too fast here. The age of Jefferson, he even gets an age applied to his name. Famous election of 1800, where in fact we have a peaceful transition from one presidential administration to the other for the first time in history. Maybe there are lessons for us today in looking at what happened then. Famous case of Marbury versus Madison, which establishes the principle of judicial review and therefore makes the Supreme Court much more relevant. He also is famous for really doubling the size of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. He did not do well with the Embargo Act of 1807. There was the first time now, 1808, 20 years after the Constitution is ratified, we have the non-importation of slaves. And we have the beginning of the Second Great Awakening in the world of religion. And he has some fighting that goes on in the Mediterranean Sea, the Barbary Pirates War. He was ranked highest for his vision and agenda setting, crisis leadership, economic management, pursued equal justice for all, public persuasion, and he does well in all of these other areas. Then he is ranked number 7, first quartile. Harry S. Truman is ranked number 6. The period 1945 to 1980, the Cold War period, he has a fair deal. He is responsible for the Taft-Hartley Act. He's got the beginning of the baby boom, second Red Scare, McCarthyism. He does, in fact, desegregate the military, which is one of his most important actions. He's responsible for the Marshall Plan, and it is George Kennan who articulates what becomes their policy of containment of communism around the world, famous Berlin airlift, and then the Korean conflict. Still going on today, in a sense. And what does he do? Well, he has not so good in terms of public persuasion. Relations with Congress are terrible because he inherits for the first time a Republican Congress, the first time since 1933, 32, and his vision setting is not fantastic. In other areas, he does credibly well, and his overall ranking is number 6. He's in the first quartile. Dwight Eisenhower, number 5. Oops, sorry. Cold War period again. He is responsible for creating the Warren Court, which famously desegregates the schools of America. He's the imaginative person who comes up with the interstate highway system, and then we have the National Defense Education Act in 1958. Again, the baby boom is moving forward. McCarthyism, I said Brown versus the Board of Education. We have the Montgomery bus boycott, the Little Rock Nine, and SNCC beginning to appear in this period with sit-ins. He practices brinkmanship with John Foster Dulles as his Secretary of State. And there is Sputnik that comes during this period. Eisenhower jumped from 9th place in the rankings in 2000 to 5th place in 2017, largely due to an increasingly favorable view of his crisis leadership. Not so great in public persuasion. He wasn't the greatest speaker there was, or in vision setting, or pursuing equal justice for all. It is going to remain for Lyndon Johnson to break through in that area. On the other hand, he does very well in some of the other areas that are part of what a president does. He ranks number 5, and again, it's in the first quartile. Number 4, the progressive era, Teddy Roosevelt. He has his square deal for America, and he protects the American people with the Meat Inspection Act, Pure Food and Drug. We have a depression that takes place, the Panic of 1907. He's famous for being a leader in the world of conservation, and of course, this is when Henry Ford's Model T appears. One of the famous things he does is he settles the anthracite coal strike. Anthracite coal was important to heat America's homes, and the coal miners were on strike. And he intervenes and is able to settle that satisfactorily. This is the time also of the muckrakers, Ida Tarbell, Upton Lewis, St. Louis Sinclair rather, and it's also when when W.E.B. Du Bois initiates the Niagara Movement, and that leads to the National Association of Colored People. Practices big stick policy, and he stimulates or fashions a revolution in Panama so they can build his canal. Little footnote, he's the first president to ever actually leave the shores of America. He's also the first president to actually ride in an airplane. He is just 42 when he becomes the youngest president. And he pursued equal justice. He does not pursue equal justice for all. This is a time when being black, this is the nadir of the black civilization in America. It was really hell to be black in America in the early part of the 19th century. And he does very little to facilitate that, although he does meet with some black leaders, but it's only tokenism. The other areas he does exceptionally well, and he is ranked number 4 overall. He's also in the first quartile. Number 3, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 33 to 45, responsible for helping to get us through the Great Depression, though some would argue as historians that he really did not get us out of the Depression. That took World War II to do that. His package is called the New Deal. He does have many acts that came about, an alphabet soup of legislative actions, many of which he rushes through or is able to get passed in the first 100 days of his administration, when everything is simply sent to the Capitol and it is passed without much discussion. During this time, we have the 21st Amendment, which is adopted, and the 20th, and that means that the president will now take office on January 20th instead of March 4th. Also, during World War II, Korematsu versus the United States Japanese internment. And we have, of course, all the things that go along with fighting the most incredibly challenging war there has ever been. He does have foreign policy things that are preoccupied with World War II, the Lend-Lease Act, the Pearl Harbor, and World War II. So he's lauded for many, many things. Among those at top, public persuasion, his international relations, and all these other areas. He does exceptionally well. There's very little that he does poorly, except he doesn't particularly do a great job of pursuing equal justice for all, compared to what he probably could have done. And he ranks number 3 and is in the first quartile. George Washington ranks number 2. This is called the constitutional period. One of the first acts of Congress is the Judicial Act of 1789 that creates the judiciary as we know it, with some later modifications. We have the emergence of 2 political parties, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. We have the first national bank of the United States in 1791. The Assumption Plan is Hamilton's plan to assume the debts of the states. And we have early manufacturing beginning. Samuel Slater's factory and the cotton gin is invented or patented in 1793. We have Republican motherhood, where the role of the mother is to train children to be good citizens of the United States. This is also when the French Revolution is going on, and it has great effect on the United States. And we have a couple of treaties during this period that are important foreign relations acts that are very much debatable as to, which one was right and which was wrong. They almost are against one another. And so he ranked above all others for moral authority, economic management, and overall performance within the context of his time. He is a pretty remarkable man, and he sets precedent for many things that are coming later. And he is therefore ranked number 2 overall. And he's in the first quartile, obviously. And number 1 is Abraham Lincoln, 1861 to 65. This is the Civil War period. And then afterwards, we have Reconstruction, which he does not participate in. We have, in 1862, it's really a remarkable session of Congress. We're fighting the Civil War at the same time as the Homestead Act is enacted, which allows the Western land to be settled. The Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862 that establishes colleges in every state and does a number of other things. The Pacific Railway Act, which won't be finalized until we get the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. He's famous for, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the beginning of the Freedmen's Bureau, and then other things that we do, including one in 1862 in Minnesota. We pretty much massacre a lot of Indians inappropriately. And then there's a Trent Affair. We won't get into that right now. His rating is largely due to his esteem for crisis leadership. And you see that he's #1 in vision setting, pursued equal justice for all. There's very little that he's ranked poorly in. International relations and public persuasion, he wasn't the greatest speaker, believe it or not. He had a high, tinny voice and so forth. But it was still, eloquent in what he composed and what he said in his speeches. So he's, and there was very little in international relations to think about during this period. And of course, he is ranked #1, which puts him in the first quartile, the blue area. And now, let's take a look at the 10 worst. This one is number 35, called The Gilded Age, Chester A. Arthur. It's an interesting contradiction. He had come as the person who I can't remember his exact title, but he headed up the port of New York, and there was where customs were collected. There was a tremendous amount of corruption, and there was a tremendous amount of just illegal stuff going on. Well, he winds up getting himself named as vice president, which is a good way to get rid of people during this period because nobody ever goes anywhere from that. And then James A. Garfield is assassinated. But what he goes on to do is enact the Pendleton Act, which is the first civil service act in the history of our country. And kind of an interesting thing. We also have the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, told the Chinese, no more of you should come to the United States. We have social developments, a very famous book by Helen Hunt Jackson, A Century of Dishonor. We have the social gospel movement, and the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn are published by Mark Twain during this period. He gets low ratings for his failure to ensure equal justice for all. Very low ratings in public persuasion, his moral authority, his international relations, his vision setting, an agenda, and we rank him number 35. He's one of those characters in history we pretty much forget about, and he really left little imprint on America. He is in the red, which would be the 4th quartile. Herbert Hoover, 29 to 33, number 36. Great Depression. Bonus Army tries to invade Washington to ask for their checks early. And they are ruthlessly put down. Not a good thing. And it happens that MacArthur is the one who leads the army that puts them down. Interesting little footnote. We have the stock market crash that comes towards the early part of his administration. Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, which is actually the stupidest tariff we ever have because it shuts down international trade just at the time when it should have been encouraged. And he does try to correct the depression with something called the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. We have a great migration going on where people are leaving the South, blacks mostly, and migrating to the cities of the North. It's a time of great poverty, great unemployment. And then we have the Stimson Doctrine, which was first Secretary of State, who says, to the world, we just will not recognize any country that has been conquered by other countries. And so he does get some credit for his administrative skills. He had been a trained engineer and a good administrator in his time, but virtually everything else that happens during his time is done relatively poorly. And we rank him number 36 and in the 4th quartile, a red quartile. Millard Fillmore, 1850-53, number 37, the antebellum period, meaning before the war. He is famous for the Compromise of 1850, which he approves. And by approving it, he facilitates movement towards the Civil War. Not probably a good act altogether. Also, Uncle Tom's Cabin is published during this period. And Perry's expedition to Japan, opening up Japan, occurs while he is president. And he is faulted for signing the Fugitive Slave Act, which was part of the Compromise of 1850. And you see there, all in red, there's almost nothing that Millard Fillmore does that's redeeming. And he ranks number 37. And so red, fourth quartile. William Henry Harrison, he only serves for about a month in the antebellum period. He'd been a famous general. It's hard to figure out how they could rate him when he does so little, but anyway, he's still in the list. And as you can see, there isn't much that he did very well. No crisis leadership, no economic management, nothing of any kind. I don't know how they can grade him higher for public persuasion and for moral authority, but these were the historians who did it. And he ranks number 38th, again in the fourth quartile. John W. Tyler, 39, 1841 to 45, again the antebellum period. He facilitates the annexation of Texas, which had been controversial because the question was it going to be slave or not slave? The telegraph by Samuel Morse is now invented, and it just revolutionizes the world for communication. This is the time of the Irish potato famine, in which millions of Irish escape their famine and move to the United States. And there's also the emergence of something called the Know Nothing Party, a movement. It's a nativist party. It believes they want to oppose all foreigners. And this was in reaction in part to all the Irish coming all at once. And then he is the facilitator, along with Webster, who is the Secretary of State, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty that establishes the northern part of Maine, and that's the final part of that border. There's only one other border change that will take place in 1853. It'll take place under Pierce. And he is a very weak president. About the only thing he does that's memorable is when Taylor dies and he becomes when Harrison dies and he becomes the president, he assumes the title of president rather than acting president. But as you can see, there's very little that he's being credited with doing well. He's ranked very low in everything, 38th overall and the fourth quartile. Warren Gamaliel Harding, 1821 to 23, number 40. This is the roaring roaring 20s period. A return to normalcy after all this strife of World War I and the Spanish flu and everything else. And so that's what he's calling for. But fortunately, he dies in office and he doesn't get to see the scandal that's emerging because of an oil scandal out in Wyoming, the Teapot Dome scandal. They enact a very restrictive tariff, the Fort Lee-McCumber tariff, a protectionist tariff. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 is in reaction to Southern and Eastern Europeans. They don't want anyone else to come into America who isn't of Northern and Western Europe descent. And this is a very restrictive act. This is when the Universal Negro Improvement Association, founded by Marcus Garvey, exists. And we have continued a great migration during this period. More and more blacks are leaving the Old South and moving north. And then the famous restrictive Washington Naval Conference of 1922-23, which can be said to be a contributory factor to World War II beginning 15 years later. So scandals plague Harding's presidency. Most famous was the Teapot Dome scandal, but there are many others. There were secret oil deals and so forth. And so he remains low in rankings, and he ranks number 40, red in the fourth quartile. Franklin Pierce, 41st. The last piece of the continental United States is added in southern Arizona, and this is called the Gadsden Purchase. It was purchased in order to facilitate building a southern railway. It's the final piece of the 48 states. Kansas-Nebraska Act, a very definite step towards the Civil War, which opened up, if you would, slavery to any territory in the West that wanted to have it. Kansas, in particular, becomes a site of outright warfare. It's called Bleeding Kansas. We have the famous Brooks-Sumner incident, in which Brooks, a congressman from the South, goes into the Senate and he beats Sumner so badly that he's permanently injured and is actually unable to participate in anything for several years. 1854, the Republican Party is founded in Ripon, Wisconsin. And it will then rapidly, it assumes a lot of disaffected Northern Democrats and old Whigs and becomes a new political party. It's the only time a major new political party emerges on the scene, and it is still with us today, though far from what it looked like in 1854. And then we have the Ostend Manifesto of 1854. Ostend is a city in Belgium where this was negotiated, and the purpose of the Ostend Manifesto was to allow the United States for a fairly modest sum to pay Spain and to take Cuba as part of the United States. The support for it was that this would become another slave state. It did not pass. It was ruled unconstitutional, and so it therefore did not move forward. So Pierce, again, one of our weakest presidents, you can see there's nothing there that looks like a redeeming quality for anything that he did. And overall, of course, he's ranked number 41 in the 4th quartile. Andrew Johnson, 1865, 69 to 42. This was his time. He assumes the presidency after Lincoln is assassinated. He tries to have a moderate reconstruction, but the radical Republicans in the Congress oppose him and really pretty much neuter him, so he's not able to get much of anything accomplished. It's during his period that we actually have the ratification of the 13th, 14th amendments. And there is Boss Tweed, who's ruling in New York City until he's found guilty a few years later of massive corruption. The first major farm organization emerges. It's called the Grange, but the technical name is the National Grange of Patrons of Husbandry. But it's a belief that farmers too need to be unionized. We have black codes and the Ku Klux Klan running rampant after the Civil War during this period. And it's during his watch that Alaska is purchased in 1867 for a fairly modest amount of money. 15 million, as I recall. A very small amount per acre. Again, you see, there's nothing on his list that shows him as being very well regarded. He's 42 to 139 and 37, but he's pretty much about at the bottom. And he's ranked number 42, 4th quartile. James Buchanan, 1857 to 61, ranked number 43. Antebellum period. During his time, we have more bleeding Kansas. The Compton Constitution is proposed in Kansas. It's a pro-slavery constitution. We have the Panic of 1857, a major depression. And they find silver out in Nevada. It's called the Comstock Lode. We have a very famous book called The Impending Crisis of the South by Hinton Helper. And this is also what Dred Scott, 1857, arguably the worst case, the worst ruling by the Supreme Court ever. And to summarize it in a few sentences or a sentence or two, Dred Scott rules that Black people can only be slaves. They cannot be people. They can never be anything but slaves. That's all they're frozen into that position forever, as well as their children and their grandchildren and on down. This is also when John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry takes place in 1859. The thing that happens here with James Buchanan is nothing. He does almost nothing in order to forestall the move towards the Civil War. He is trying to walk a tightrope between the North and the South, and he satisfies neither one. low rankings for crisis leadership. He couldn't grasp the enormity of Americans' divisions over slavery, ignoring the strife and letting the issue fester in the years leading up to the Civil War. Look at, there he is, 43, 42, 141 in there. And so he ranks number 43. And generally, in most historical rankings, he is ranked at the very bottom, red, fourth quartile. So now we're going to take a look at the Siena College Research Institute Presidential Expert Poll of 2018. This was their 6th presidential poll. What we can predict is that sometime about a year from now, they will do another one. It was initiated first in 1982 and occurs 1 year into the term of each new president. It is currently a survey of 157 presidential scholars across a range of leadership parameters. The ranking gave the top 5 spots to George Washington, Franklin Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and Thomas Jefferson. This top 5, described as Mount Rushmore plus FDR, was consistent with prior surveys. Washington had been ranked 4th in all previous surveys and FDR 1st. So here, without getting into too much detail, is the first 5 presidents: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. And what you see is a lot of blue there. Blue is good. Blue is in the top quartile. And you got varying numbers, of course, and and we're not going to focus on any one of these particular numbers. The one who does not get such great rankings is Adams. His court appointments are not well regarded. And his luck, he is not a lucky man. The things that happen to and around him simply foretell that he will not do as well as other presidents. And he is lacking in imagination. So anyway, what you see here is mostly blue and some green, and all of these presidents are very effective on the whole. Then we have the next 5 presidents. Now you're beginning to see a different pattern emerge here. You're beginning to see a lot of red the further over to the right that you go. Red is not good. Let's take a look moment in particular at Andrew Jackson, who's noted for being an effective and a powerful president by many historians. But his background is limited. He did not have a great deal of education, and so it was not like he was a great scholar as he came into any of his leadership roles. All this was a man who could not compromise. He was rigid as anybody who's ever occupied the presidency, and this would cause him problems as he went along. The next 5, Polk, Taylor, Fillmore, Pierce, Buchanan. Notice in the last 3 there is nothing redeeming about any one of them, according to the historians. On the other hand, James K. Polk does get a lot of blue and green. James K. Polk came into office vowing to do 5 things and serve 1 term. He did accomplish all 5 things that he wanted to accomplish. He served 1 term and then he left. Unfortunately, on the way back to Tennessee, he caught cholera and he died. Zachary Taylor is noted for his integrity, and that is important to note. He is not loaded for his luck, because he dies in office, for one thing, nor his party leadership, because he leaves an enormous mess. Millard Fillmore is his vice president, and Millard Fillmore will not be a great president. As you can see, all of his are red. And the party leadership and then court appointments were not particularly fantastic. The next 5 presidents: Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes. As you can see, Abraham Lincoln is virtually all blue except for his background. And of course, his background out as a poor, born in Kentucky, raised in Illinois, and he's a self-taught lawyer, and he does very well that way, but he has no Harvard education for him. He is also not quite lucky in everything, because the Civil War cannot be called a lucky event in any analysis. Then we move into the next ones: Chester A. Arthur, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley, and Theodore Roosevelt. Well, again, over on the right, you see Theodore Roosevelt, all blue. He's ranked number 4. The others during this period are ranked quite low. McKinley has got a decent ranking, a lot of green in there, so he'd be in the second quartile. But especially the first 3, just nothing particularly redeeming about them and their presidency. Theodore Roosevelt, however, had one major flaw. He was not a good compromiser. It was sort of his way or the highway in many cases as his presidency. Then we have William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover. Of these, Woodrow Wilson has a problem with his ability to compromise. If he had compromised on the League of Nations, there probably could have been a League of Nations, but he refused to accept any accommodation with the Senate that needed to confirm the treaty. And so it therefore did not pass. He also did not avoid crucial mistakes, and that was one of the crucial mistakes that he made. Then we have Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson. Now we're back to a lot more blue. Historians are regarding these presidents much more much more positively. Harry S. Truman, though, comes from a very modest background. There's no college in his background. He's a haberdasher, a World War I corporal. Not much to recommend him as president, and yet he is number 9. He's one of the more successful presidents we have. Lyndon B. Johnson is faulted for his integrity. Didn't always know what was the truth with Lyndon B. Johnson. And his foreign policy accomplishments because of Vietnam are ranked very low, and he did not avoid crucial mistakes. What he could have done to avoid Vietnam, I don't know if anybody could argue about that, but some think he should have been able to do something to not get us so deeply immersed in this terrible war. Then you have Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. Again, a more mixed record of these people. Let me just call your attention to integrity. Richard Nixon is ranked about as low as you can be in integrity, and most of you know history well enough to know why that would be. Gerald Ford, who follows him, is ranked quite high in integrity, as is Jimmy Carter. That's one of his strongest points, his integrity. We all know that Richard Nixon had abominable relations with Congress. It was a Democrat Congress for both of the years, for all the years that he was president, and those were not good years that way. And he did not avoid crucial mistakes. Arguably, he could have and should have avoided Watergate altogether. And the experts, of course, call him number 38, very low. Gerald Ford had a good ability to compromise. It's important in a president to have that ability, because there are times when you gain and sometimes when you lose, but you have to be willing to talk with your opposition. Jimmy Carter had bad luck. The economic times went south for him, and he just did not succeed very well. He also was not great at party leadership. The party didn't really like him all that well, and his relations with Congress were always testy. And he did not avoid crucial mistakes. Then we have Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. And you will note that the integrity of Bill Clinton gets slammed here, and guess why? It's Monica Lewinsky and that whole affair that causes his integrity. I did not have sex with that woman. Well, I think we know differently. George W. Bush gets faulted for his intelligence. I thought that was an interesting analysis. So then you ask yourself, those of you who have been following news all these past 4 years, where will Donald Trump rank? Siena College Research Institute Presidential Expert Poll of 2018 published on February 13, 2019, released its 6th presidential poll. This one first initiated in 1982, occurs 1 year into the term of each new president. Currently a survey of 157 presidential scholars across a range of leadership parameters. The ranking gave the top 5 spots to George Washington, Franklin Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and Thomas Jefferson. This top 5, described as Mount Rushmore plus FDR, was consistent with prior surveys. Washington had been ranked 4th in all previous surveys and FDR 1st. Please note, this is 2018. This is 2 years ago. And so it would clearly have changed during that time. But what did we find out on that poll anyway? Well, first of all, we find out there's a lot of red there. A lot of red. 43, 40, 44, 44. Lots of 40s down there in terms of historians' ranking of it. They did not see much in terms of redeeming quality. They did say that Donald Trump is a very lucky man. At least he was as of 2018. Then it was also apparent from the very beginning he was willing to take risks. And I don't think much of what we know about him would contradict that. And so he ranks in that time, in that poll, 42nd, or the red 4th quartile. And so now, will it stay there? Will it go up? Will it be different? What will it look like in 20 years? We don't know about that. That's why we do these ratings. Now, I won't go through all of these because it's just too many, but we will start to take a look at how did the other 24 rank. Number 11 would have been Woodrow Wilson. Lots was happening during his period. We had several amendments. We actually, the 16th, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th amendments all take place while he's president. Now, the 16th and 17th had already started before he assumes office, but they happen while he's there. But lots of things happening. The Federal Reserve is established in 1913, which provides stability, or is supposed to, in our economic system, our monetary system. World War I occurs during his period, and he's famous for trying to promulgate his 14 points. And so how do we rate him? Well, he gets a little bit of credit for his international relations. He made sincere attempts to do some things. His relations with Congress were up to a point good up until the League of Nations debate. But he pursued equal justice for all. Let me tell you, this again is, along with this, the nadir of African-American existence in the country. He was he was a child of Virginia, and historians today are really bothered by his prejudice. And he exhibited many different ways. There were almost no black people employed in government during this period, or very few, only as waiters and cleaners and cooks and so forth. So it was not a good time to be African American, or any other minority for that matter. And so he ranks number 11. He's in the blue category. He's still in the upper quartile, but barely. Barack Obama, number 12. War on Terror takes place during his time. The Affordable Care Act, the Tea Party, big movement that eventually moves into what we have happening in the last months here. The Tea Party itself does not exist, but its movement, its ideas do. And we had the Great Recession in 2007 and 2009, and then a famous American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that tries to get us out of that and arguably was successful. He appoints Sotomayor to the Supreme Court. He's repeals Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And we have Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, which legalizes gay marriage in this country. And so how do we look at him? This is a C-SPAN list. He pursued equal justice for all, but his relations for Congress were not particularly good. It always bothered me that he was not quite as quick to call different leaders in and have private conversations with them. Obama ranks 12th in the green or second quartile. James Monroe, number 13. And he is, this is the era of good feelings, but it was not an era of good feelings. They weren't good at all. McCulloch versus Maryland, Gibbons versus Ogden, a couple of particularly pivotal Supreme Court cases. During his watch, the Missouri Compromise is arrived at, and which allows slavery south of a line going across the country, the border of Missouri. We have Henry Clay promoting the American system. We have a panic during this period. Anyway, it's kind of an interesting time. He is pursued equal justice for all? No, but he's ranked number 13. Established the Monroe Doctrine, which warned European nations not to colonize or interfere with the Western Hemisphere. And he's green. James K. Polk, I mentioned him a little bit ago. Again, the California Gold Rush takes place during his presidency. Manifest Destiny, Irish Potato Famine, Seneca Falls Convention. This is women and some men gathering to talk about women getting rights, including the vote, which they're not going to get for another 70 years. There's a Free Soil Party that emerges during this period, eventually joins with the Republicans. The one thing Polk does is he adds this huge amount of territory to the United States. All of the Mexican territory, all of California, all of Oregon. And so our country, I've forgotten the exact number, but it almost doubles in size under his presidency. And this is the one who promised to do 5 things. He accomplished all 5 of them, and then he left office. Okay, and 800,000 square miles of land were added. Crisis leadership, administrative skills. He was ranked equal justice for all. This was not important during this period. And he is ranked number 14th overall. Again, he's in the 2nd quartile. And Bill Clinton, the Republican Revolution of 1994, Republican Party reasserting itself in a way it had not done for a long time. Newt Gingrich has what's called a contract with America, which is good public relations. I don't know if it really ever accomplishes all that much. We always know the Lewinsky scandal. I've always said that, you know, the history of Bill Clinton, no matter how many good and wonderful things he does, when the history of Bill Clinton and his administration is written, no matter how many praiseworthy things they say about them, they will always have a comma and then, and the Lewinsky scandal, because it's the one thing that tarnishes him and resulted in him being impeached. Not because he engaged in inappropriate sexual conduct, but because he lied to a federal court, and that's called perjury, and the courts take a very dim view of perjury. So anyway, North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement in 1994 and so forth. Clinton's ranking jumped from 21st place to 15th place in the C-SPAN Historian Survey between 2000 and 2017. And so you see, you do jump around on these lists depending upon who's compiling them and in what year they're being compiled. He was really noted very strongly for his ability to engage in public persuasion. He was good at economic management. This is a period when the economy boomed all the way through, a lot of it based on high technology, and pursued equal justice for all. He did make strides for all in that area. Moral authority, he loses that because of the Lewinsky scandal. And he ranks number 15, again, puts him in the 2nd quartile. At this point, I'm noticing I'm about 3 or 4 minutes to the appointed hour, and so I'm going to stop at that point, and I'm going to, and I can go through all of this later if you want to stick around, but it's, as you can see, there are a lot of presidents to look at, and we're not going to look at all of them. I will stop for a moment, though, because they're more contemporary, and I may mention Gerald Ford, and he inherits the presidency, and on the whole, he does pretty well. is ranked highest for his moral authority and so forth. Jimmy Carter, who probably should never have been president. He's had a great post-presidency, but Jimmy Carter is pursuing equal justice for all and so forth. Very, very low for crisis leadership. And then we'll get Nixon. Nixon is ranked number 28, and he does not get many good marks for anything. He did do well in international relations. He opens up China for us, and I guess that's probably the most important thing he did. Overall, he ranks number 28. And then we'll make sure we mention, you notice I'm going down a long ways to get to him. George W. Bush, 33rd. And he too does not have a great deal. He's down in the third quartile, lowest ranking in international relations. And he gets us involved in Iraq and Iran, and that is not good. Historians surveyed by C-SPAN have reevaluated his record, and he's moved up in the rankings from 36th place in 2009 to 33rd place today, at least in this rating. Now, I want to move quickly down to Mr. Felsenburgh. I'll show you the book as soon as we're done here, but his name is Elvin Felsenburgh, and in 2008, he wrote a book in which he evaluated only 6 characters or 6 characteristics of presidents. And I thought his book was rather well reasoned and a good explanation. He looked at character, vision, competence, economic policy, and preserving liberty and defense and national security. His analysis is that the most important of these is character. And you'll notice here that among the top 5 that he ranked them, he ranks Lincoln again, like many people do, number 1, Washington number 2, Teddy Roosevelt number 3. He has Reagan up at number 3, Eisenhower at 5, and Franklin Roosevelt at number 6. The next presidents, Taylor, Grant, McKinley, Truman, and Kennedy, rank number 7. They're tied for that position, but they vary in character. Grant's character a little less than the others, Kennedy's character a little less than the others, but it's a fascinating explanation of his rating. And then the next ranking group, Coolidge, Harrison, Benjamin Harrison, John Adams, Jefferson, Monroe, John Quincy Adams, Wilson, George Bush, George H.W. Bush. You can see that in terms of character, Coolidge and Harrison and Adams and H.W. Bush rank pretty well, but and John Quincy Adams as well. And the others not so well. But you see how they get to their averages when he does it on the other end of things. And then we have a large group here that are 20th and 22nd and 24th and 26th and 29th. And you see how those rank. Taft and Cleveland and Madison are the only ones, and Ford are the only ones who get a 5 for character here. The others are down from that, and you can just use your own analysis or so. So then this is what the final group looks like. Van Buren, Fillmore, Tyler, Hoover, Nixon, Pierce, Andrew Johnson, and Buchanan. And I'm trying to remember, he did this in 2008, and there were some presidents he refused to rank. He, of course, did not include Obama in this because Obama would have been just barely about to start on his presidency. But he does have the others all included. So anyway, and I think he dropped out the first Harrison as well, because he didn't have enough time in office.